The topic of today, I find it is extremely topical, is global value chains. And in particular, we will discuss restructuring of global value chains, and in particular, the challenge that restructuring global value chain raises, and how we can actually move towards a new normal trade policy, if ever, I would say. So I'm really pleased to introduce this event. So this event is actually the last step of an Horizon Europe project, which is called Twin Seats. And Roberta Capello, who is the coordinator of this project, unfortunately couldn't make it in person because Milano Airport was closed this morning due to bad weather. So quite part of the team of the project couldn't make it to Brussels this morning. But Roberta is connected online. So I will just now hand over the floor to Roberta to say a few words about the project. Welcome, Roberta.
Thank you, Cinzia. Hello, everybody. I think you can imagine how stressed I am for not being with you. It's a real pity that I couldn't make because you know that we put a lot of effort in Twin Seats, and I think that this event is extremely important for launching a debate on our results and on the future of Europe. So, okay, but climate change is there. And so we have on the newspapers that Milan had this morning streets as rivers, as never happened over the last decades. So it was really an extreme event. So sorry for that, for not being with you. In any case, I would like also to thank the Center for European Policy Study because they host our conference in a very friendly and very cooperative attitude, not only for what happened this morning, but for the whole organization of the conference. So I'm really grateful to Cinzia Alcidi and to all her staff and the Center for European Policy Study for their hospitality. Going to the issue or to our program, as Cinzia said, it is a very timely but also very interesting debate. Just a few words on the Twin Seats. The Twin Seats started, and I still remember very well, we were writing the proposal in the first lockdown, the beginning of the COVID. And at that time, we had the huge pressure to understand what would have happened in a post-COVID period. Also, in this case, to the restructuring of global value chains. What would have been the impact of COVID on these trade relationships? So we started with great emphasis on that, and we began to work on that issue. But while we were developing the project, many other drastic events happened. And in particular, we started in 2022 with the first conflict, European conflict, Ukraine, Russia, that again showed the fragility of the trade relationships, the trading task relationships. So we decided to reorient a little bit, or to add, we studied the COVID effects, but then we added also the other, let's say, extreme effects. Not to say what happened with the new Trump's administration. And again, the Twin Seat partners did a lot of efforts in order to reorient and again to enrich the analysis towards the scenarios with which we could foresee what the effects of these new, let's say, like call it in a diplomatic way, new trade relationships that are imposed to the world by Trump and his administration. So we went again into a new issue. So in a certain sense, not to say, but we did 3 projects in one. And so we are now very pleased to present, and not to show how good we are, but to discuss really our results. And this is why we start with this discussion first, with these short presentations of the huge 3 years of work that we did. And then we move to a panel discussion. Of course, we have also a very interesting keynote speaker that Cinzia will introduce to you. And again, I would like to thank our keynote speaker for taking his time and being with us to present the situation nowadays. So I hope you will enjoy our afternoon. And again, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. I give the floor to Cinzia again.
Thank you, Roberta. So it's exactly 1:40, and we are perfectly on time. And I'm very pleased to have as a keynote speaker Ute Slotboom. She is the director at DG Grow for supply chains and business analysis. So really very extreme good fit actually for the discussion of today. And as some of you in this room may know, the team, the chief economist team at DG Grow is doing an excellent work when it comes to value chains, and not only, but certainly this is a topic of great interest, and I'm sure Ute will share some insights from the work they are doing. Please, Ute, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here, and indeed great that you have organized this event and will present your results, which will certainly also inform our work and enrich the analysis that we have done. We have gone as far as renaming our directorate in the Commission's Directorate General for Industry and Single Market to be the Supply Chains and Business Analysis Directorate, which says something, and says quite a lot about the importance of the topic. And of course, I wanted to start by highlighting some of our results. I wanted to raise 4 issues, look at 4 questions in my opening remarks today. First, what do we know of supply chains? And then I will say what we know in the European Commission in short. Secondly, what are the main factors that are now shaping the changes in global supply chains? We already heard that your project kept on changing and evolving, and it became 3 projects in one. I will present you 4 projects of 4 studies that we have done. Thirdly, what are the consequences of the situation where we are now? What does it mean in particular for EU companies? And finally, some words on what we are doing in the European Commission to address supply chain risks and disturbances. But I will focus more on the analytical side, assuming that this is an audience which is really interested in your project and hopefully also in our work. So we started to work more on supply chains once the pandemic hit, because that really exposed the vulnerabilities that we have. The vulnerabilities, the dependencies on the lowest cost supplier on the other side of the planet, these developed over years and over decades, but very few risks materialized. It was really during the pandemic when imports from China came to a halt, a lot of factories closed in the EU, borders closed even inside the single market, that we really experienced in a very brutal way what it means to suffer from disturbances in the most elementary and basic supply chains like medicine. The first paper, and of course I have at least one colleague here from the chief economist team, our DG. The first paper that the chief economist produced was on trade data. My colleagues looked at trade flows and identified products which were not produced in the EU, to at least not to any significant amounts, and which were only imported from 1 or 2 third countries. And then they run the judgmental selection of is the product strategic or not. Probably antibiotics is very strategic if you don't get access. Whether Christmas lights, which also are basically imported and basically from one country, they are probably less strategic. So the selection was whatever is important for security, defense, health, or our green and digital transition was strategic. The analysis of more than 5,000 products ended up with 204 products that were considered to be strategic dependencies. This was a lot of pharmaceutical ingredients, well, semiconductors, electronic components, a lot of critical raw materials. And of course, you will realize that over time, the EU may develop production facilities in many products, but raw materials which are not available in the EU have to be imported from somewhere. In terms of what the analysis showed of the origin of the dependencies, pointed at one country, and that country is China. More than 50% of these critical dependencies were imports which only came from China. That was raw materials, cell phones, laptops. The US was the second on the list. Their turbines, vehicles from the US. Vietnam was third on the list, and then there were other countries like India where the EU imports a lot of active pharmaceutical ingredients. Then secondly, to have a tool to monitor the evolution of dependencies over time, we developed an index which is called the External Vulnerability Index, published in our annual Single Market and Competitiveness report, January this year. And this is a mix of trade dependencies data and competitiveness indicators data. So we are vulnerable if we depend on imports from third countries which are not available from anywhere else, and if we are not competitive in what we produce. The details of that index are available, but just in short, the EU is more exposed to external trade vulnerabilities than China, because with this index you can calculate the dependencies and weaknesses values for all the countries. So China has improved a lot over time and are less exposed than us and less exposed than the United States. The good news for the EU is that we are more resilient than the United States, with the exception of semiconductors, where the United States has improved and they are more self-sufficient and more competitive than we are. But this on the evolution, this is an index that we will continue to monitor over time. And I can say to the people who are there that there are still seats in the front row if you want to join. Another very interesting supply chain related analysis relates to what happened to our trade flows with the trade partners and countries which are not exactly trade partners. Last year, we published a paper on the trading patterns and how EU's import patterns evolved since the pandemic. And quite interestingly, and maybe in terms of what you might expect, there is already first evidence of more reshoring or nearshoring. The trade among the member states continues to increase. There was a little hiccup during the pandemic, but we are a very open internal market and we are very open externally. But both indicators still show very high level of openness. But there is more of the imports of an EU country come from inside the EU and more come from our neighboring countries, candidate countries and close neighborhood countries with which we have partnership agreements. Also, third countries far away with which we have free trade agreements or other partnership agreements, we trade more where you look at the groups. Then in contrast, this comes at the expense of imports from third countries like China, like Russia, against which sanctions were imposed, countries with which we don't have trade agreements or partnership agreements. Their trade share declined by almost 1 percentage point per year during the period for which the data refer to. And then finally, the final piece of analysis that I wanted to highlight is the annual business survey on supply chains, which the European Investment Bank and we run together. It's 13,000 companies surveyed every year across the EU and separated by size category. There, the good news is that companies report fewer supply chain disturbances now. The latest survey, which was published this year, compares 2023 to 2024. And in that period, the number of companies which reported supply chain disturbances in raw materials or logistics disturbances halved. It was one company out of 3 in 2023 reporting disturbances, and now it is less than 20%. It's 17% for raw materials, 19% for logistics disturbances. So for the moment, the supply chain problems have been mitigated slightly, but there's a lot more work to be done to be better prepared for whatever the next crisis is. So, second question, what are the consequences of supply chain vulnerabilities and the evolution that we are witnessing? Of course, there is a risk of our losing competitiveness in terms of us losing markets, losing jobs, losing incomes, but also the economic security risks of losing control of some of the strategic technologies that we use and that may be controlled by others outside the EU. For companies, being more aware of the risks that you may lose the, let's call it a Chinese supplier, and suddenly you cannot import. That risk has pushed companies to do more risk management, to diversify, to do more in terms of stockpiling, to find partners nearby, to cooperate more with others. But of course, some of these policies, they are good and they are economically justified, but they also involve a cost. It is no longer a policy of buy from the one cheapest supplier that you find on the planet. Also, in the company service of the European Investment Bank, we see that currently uncertainty is the biggest factor holding back investment. And this, of course, closely relates to supply chain uncertainty, but also to policies of certain third countries. And of course, the consequence for the global trading system, the rules-based trading system is quickly eroding, and at least in my opinion, there are no winners in this. Basically everybody loses, maybe with some specific short-term exceptions, but looking at the big trading blocks, nobody's really benefiting from the big trading blocks turning more inside. So I think I jumped over my question of what are the factors that are really shaping the events, but I have said it already. It's the China policies. Now it is very much the policies of the current US administration. We are facing war in Europe. There's much more focus now on defense than other areas. We have sanctions against Russia. We have lost one market, which especially for the countries on the eastern border of the EU was an important export market, and for many also an important import supplier, for example, for fertilizers and of course for energy. Then EU's weakened competitiveness, is it the cause or is it the consequence? And for me, the relative loss of our competitiveness is more of a cause of why our supply chains are changing. Europe has, to some extent, become stuck at medium technologies, while others have moved ahead fast. Now there are components, there are technologies where we depend on imports from others. And from that perspective, I would see Europe's competitiveness as one of the root causes to be addressed in order to become more resilient and more stable in today's roaring supply chain landscape. So finally, some words on what we are doing. I should start by saying that we are a government, we are civil servants, and of course companies themselves are the first ones to have risk mitigation strategies. They have to see how they diversify their supply chains and what risk mitigation measures they take. But for example, in the area of trade policy, it is the EU which is negotiating our partnerships. And I would maybe start with that. Under the economic security strategy, which really goes hand in hand with economic security, welfare, competitiveness, we have three categories. We speak about three letters, P. Protect, so if there is unfair competition, then we have to use our trade policy instruments to create a level playing field. Promote, sort of help EU industry to become more competitive. And thirdly, partnerships with third countries, diversify further. With third countries, we have a lot of dialogues to compare our policies. For those interested in reading, every January in our annual competitiveness report, we publish a summary of what resilience policies our main third country competitors put in place. So the US subsidies, but also what Japan is doing to collect critical stockpiles where the government is paying companies for either holding stocks or producing certain goods which they then hold in stocks for crisis. What is Australia doing? What is New Zealand doing? We are also in dialogue with many of our partner countries on this. Then free trade agreements. We are currently pursuing, as the Commission, free trade agreement negotiations with India, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and the United Arab Emirates. This is in order to diversify, to continue trading with the rest of the world. We are with countries, maybe more of developing countries. We have a new notion of clean trade and investment partnerships, which would create markets for these countries, and the EU companies could invest there and create partnerships with the support of the EU structure and sometimes our partnership instruments. There are other ways to build coalitions, and the cooperation in G7 is one of the ways of looking at supply chains and the global trading system with our partners. But with that, I would move to the protect part, protecting the single market. The EU slogan is that we remain open to international competition as much as possible, but we are assertive where it is needed. So one example is the countervailing duties against Chinese electric vehicle imports. The foreign subsidies regulation is now in place, and the screening of inward FDI into the EU, the Commission has put forward a proposal to strengthen the process to see that we don't lose our technology advantage by letting in investors which do not bring value added to the EU. There are still safeguards coming up, and the other trade policy instruments will also be used actively. And that brings me to the last point, which is promoting our own industry. A year ago, Mario Draghi published his report on Europe's competitiveness. Last week was the event of 1 year on. Where are we? The Commission has done a lot. The outcomes are still not something that anybody can be satisfied with. Much more work is needed. We have a competitiveness compass which sets out the 3 main areas of work. It is innovation, scaling up everything that goes under that, keeping investments in the EU. It's secondly, decarbonization, promoting our good clean tech industries. And thirdly, economic security and everything that comes with that. We also have sector-specific actions which have been put in place. An action plan for critical raw materials, mining more in the EU in a clean and sustainable way, forging partnerships with third countries, but also recycling much more of the raw materials which sometimes go to waste. Towards the end of this year, we will be presenting the Industrial Accelerator Act, which will support lead markets in Europe, in particular in energy-intensive industry sectors. There are also plans for the steel and metals sector published earlier this year, automotive, chemicals, to address the sector-specific barriers. With that, maybe the last proposal in the pipeline, which I would like to mention, is the revision of our public procurement directives. Public procurement represents 16% of GDP. It is a very powerful tool to be used to create lead markets, to push for innovation. And in the current global situation, the idea is also to introduce some made in Europe criteria into public procurement in the EU. Our single market remains the basis for all this. We have 450 million consumers. We have our strengths in many areas which need to be reinforced, and we need to do much more to boost our competitiveness in other areas. The President also announced a single market roadmap to 2028, and at least if you asked me, we would have to bring along the member states to that roadmap. A lot of the obstacles on the single market depend on obstacles which individual member states have put in place, and it is very important to work in cooperation with the member states to address them. I will stop here and happy to take questions if there's time and if there's interest.
Thanks very much, Uti. This was really very interesting. I would like we have about 10 minutes if there are questions. I see already 3, 4. Maybe abuse of my role also to break the ice. I mean, the beginning of this year was really very turbulent, you know, and we had this major shock with the US tariffs. This came after COVID, after the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And my expectation was actually to see much more disruption. So I was nicely surprised by the resilience of value chain. Do you have an answer for this? What do you think is behind this resilience? And then I'm opening the floor for questions.
So maybe a quick answer is that somehow the US turbulence was anticipated. A lot of companies were expecting big things. We also saw a peak in the first quarter of this year in industrial production, which at least some of us interpreted as companies trying to produce and sell to the US market before any trade barriers are put in place. So I think that for now it was the anticipation, and since relatively quickly there was the joint statement and a deal which at least put an end to the overall uncertainty. And of course details are being negotiated and the situation will evolve, but I believe that the period of huge uncertainty was spent in sort of taking a pause in companies and trying to see where the situation lands. And now at least we have the statement to move ahead. That's a quick answer.
Thank you. I'll take the 4 questions all at once.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Uti. I'm Megan Richards. I wanted to ask you a question about Made in Europe and whether DG Grow has done some analyses such as that you've done on the global value change to see the economic and financial benefits. And to what extent will this have an impact, for example, on some of our free trade agreements, like the Canada-EU free trade agreement?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, yes, I'm Rebecca Caravalli, a postdoctoral researcher in an ERC project, Chain Law, at the University of Maastricht. I was just wondering whether in your analysis you also witness how EU legislation in non-directly trade laws affect the resilience or the patterns of global value chains, because we know, I mean, there is the Brussels effect, but also other legislation like the recent revision of the Product Liability Directive that provides consumers with a certain set of rights against the economic operators located outside of the EU borders. It may impact on the viability of the restructuring and the geographical scope of GVCs. And I was just wondering whether in your analysis you are witnessing this type of dynamics, or if so, how? Thanks.
I think there was...
Hello, thanks a lot. I'm Arne Köppel from FTI Consulting. You mentioned the steel safeguard or trade measures. Is it possible to elaborate a little bit how that's going to look like? Thank you very much.
I think there was, the last one here.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Andy Bounds from the Financial Times. I just had a question about the figures about the diversification of imports. So you said it's gone down by 1% from China and other countries. I mean, the imports from China have grown quite substantially. So I just wonder, are you going by value and volume? And are the things we're not importing, are we still as dependent on Chinese for these key issues, critical raw materials and so on that you mentioned, the 200 odd things as we were before this started? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe I go in reverse order and start with the China question. When I said that we are trading less in terms of the overall share in exports with country groups, China is part of the big group of China, Russia, most African countries, some Asian countries with which we have no trade agreement. So indeed, it's not that our imports from China have declined by 1%. But what we show in that paper is that for this group over 2 years, the share of this group of countries with which we have no trade or partnership agreements has declined by 1.8%. So that would be on that. On steel safeguards, unfortunately, of course, being from the industry part, not trade part, I will not react. On the Brussels effect, my colleagues also have written a very interesting paper, which you find in the series Single Market Economic Papers. And what they saw was that indeed a lot of third countries have sought inspiration in EU rules when writing their national product legislation. And this has made it easier to export to the EU market because the products produced domestically outside the EU already comply with the EU rules. This has been the traditional wisdom. Now Others are coming very quickly into international standardization organizations. Also, China has a very active standardization policy. We have not looked at the evolution over time, but one could expect that our ability to set global regulations is seriously being challenged. But what we still have is our very large internal market with 450 million consumers, regulatory stability compared to many other countries, openness, transparency, and indeed stability of regulation. I believe that this will keep Europe an interesting place to sell also in the future. The question on made in Europe, of course, our lawyers will screen whatever is written and check that they are in line with our international commitments. The idea is also very much to make sure that we create lead markets for European companies to produce. Very often when there is a new technology or new innovation, the company doesn't have the courage to invest in production facilities when it's not known that the buyers and off-takers are there. And using public procurement to create such lead markets would be a very good way forward. So this is very much on the agenda, but of course not becoming a closed economy which stops trading. I mean, the partnerships agenda is very strong on our radar screen. I think that was it. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ute. Thank you. We are now moving to the presentation of the insights from Twin Seed project. So I would like to invite the speakers to come on stage. So, of course, Roberta will be connected online. Laura Resmini will also be connected online. Then we have Torben. Torben Pedersen, please. And then Michael Landesman. And I think this is it. But for...
Maria.
Maria Cardoso Vecina. Cadarso Vecina. Sorry. And Roberta, I hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Cinzia. Well, thank you very much to our keynote speaker because she opened to many issues that are also related to what we are going to discuss. As I told you before, the Twin Seeds project aimed at analyzing in both qualitative and quantitative way the impact of JVC restructuring on different aspects that were also mentioned by our keynote speaker. First of all, we looked at what happened with JVC restructuring on employment dynamics. Then there is the big issues of environmental challenges that are there. Then we move to competitiveness, and so how JVC restructuring affects or increases competitiveness. In any case, it changes the rules of the game. And then we will move to, as I said before, to scenarios and the new trade rules and the new level playing fields that are, let's say, imposed in a certain sense to Europe by the actual situation. The speakers are, just to let you know why they are there. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all partners of Twin Seeds because they've always been extremely sensitive but extremely committed to the project. So this means that they worked for what they were asked to do, but even more than that, with interest in looking into these issues. The speakers are the work package leaders, so the leaders of the issues that each of them has on the title, and so they are trying to produce a summary of what was done. And I invite you, if you are interested, to look at our webpage because we produced a lot of materials that can lead you to much better insights of our analysis. So I'd like to introduce first Laura Resmini from Bicocca University in Milan, that she was also stuck due to the storm in Milan today. So she will tell you about JVC, what we did on JVC's restructuring and employment dynamics. Laura, the floor is yours. I think you can share the slides, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Laura. The floor is yours. 10 minutes to go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Roberta, for your nice introduction. Thank you for everybody to attending this event. I am sorry not to be there in present, but you know, it was because the bad weather condition in Milano. Now I would like just to present you, just to give you a flavor of the results that we get in Work Package 3 that was focused on the effect of JVC reorganization on employment and inequality. 5 different research units collaborate in this Work Package. They apply several different quantitative and qualitative approach, and this allow us to provide a very nuanced picture of the different influences JVC may have on labor market outcome, like employment level and growth, or the skill composition of the labor force, and also to understand the potential effect on JVC on inequalities, working condition, and perhaps exclusion. So, of course, I have not the time to discuss in detail all the interesting result that we got. Therefore, I would like just to summarize the main messages that can be drawn from all our research work and the potential implication for the policy intervention. So the first big result that we got is that JVC reorganization is not per se associated with a shift in manufacturing jobs. And this is it is mainly due to the presence of a lot of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity has a different sources. The first source of heterogeneity is the nature of the reorganization process. JVC may continue to expand, or they may shift, come back home so we have different process of reshoring, nearshoring, and backshoring. What we found is that, for example, reshoring is associated with a relatively higher growth of low-skilled occupation and overall employment, while offshoring can increase employment, but only for high-skilled jobs. Then we explore in detail one specific form of the JVC reorganization process, that is backshoring. That is the process to which local economic systems try to become more independent from foreign input and while expanding domestic input. So what we found is that even though the reorganization process is the same, the result, the impact on the labor market can be different according to other 2 important phenomena. The first is the different industrial history of EU regions, and the second one is related to the innovation path at work. Concerning industrial history, we found that backshoring led to higher manufacturing job growth in traditional manufacturing regions, while but not in emerging manufacturing regions. In that regions, backshoring brought only to an increase in production value added. As for the innovation pathway, our findings demonstrate that automation and robotization may promote employment growth, but can also display routine and manual jobs. What about inequalities, the second big goal of Work Package 3? Our results highlight the presence of risks of increasing inequality and job insecurity. More in detail, our results demonstrate that JVC restructuring has exacerbated job polarization. But this trend is amplified in regions with high concentration of multinational enterprises, which on average offshore low value-added activity performed by unskilled workers, while they kept at home high-skill activities performed by high-skilled workers. Moreover, and also more interesting, we found that the negative impact on job polarization is mitigated in regions belonging to countries with robust employment protection legislation. Analysis at sectoral level also demonstrated that JVC participation is associated with high levels of job insecurity, but, and this is good news, JVC participation is not associated with gender discrimination. So overall, our finding highlight the presence of heterogeneous effect on JVC reorganization on local labor market. Secondly, they also highlight that there are a strong interconnection among JVC restructuring, technological change, and labor market institutions. And finally, our finding indicate the existence of significant trade-off. Just an example, while automation and reshoring can support productivity and competitiveness, they may also exacerbate regional economic inequalities. So, what does it mean from a policy perspective? From this point of view, I think that the main message of our results are twofold. First, there is a strong need for place-based policies to achieve reindustrialization and also manufacturing employment growth. Secondly, there is also a strong need for coordinated policy intervention to exploit inclusive policy, support technological progress, and of course, promote equitable labor markets. If you are interested in learning more about the result of our work package, I invite you to read our report when all the results and the research activity is described in details. And also I invite you to read our policy brief, and there you can find several examples of all the policy intervention or the policy domain that need to be coordinated in order to maximize the benefit from JVC participation while mitigating the adverse effect of JVC on inequalities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Laura. I think we could go on, even and then if there are questions, we collect them at the end, if you agree, okay? Then we move to Maria Cardazo from the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, speaking about environmental challenges in JVC's restructuring. Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Good afternoon, all. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the presentation I prepared is a bit longer than the previous one. Thank you. And in my case, I'm going to present the environmental challenges in GBC restructuring we achieved through it's a summary of the results, main conclusions, and policy recommendations we achieved through the research of the Twin Cities project in Work Package 4, and the institutions involved were the Copenhagen Business School, the Poznan University of Economics and Business, the Toulouse Business School, and the University of Castilla-La Mancha, that is my own institution. Finish from here. Oh, okay, here it is. I would like to have you some context and building in previous presentations, including the speaker, the keynote speaker. I would like to focus on how GBC's vulnerability highlights firms and countries' exposure and trade interdependencies that give room to GBC restructuring and reshoring strategies looking for resilience and sustainability. But these goals, resilience and sustainability, are deeply interconnected with the fight against climate change, and all hinge on this result, on the climate goal. Why? Because Europe is warming at twice the global average, the fastest warming continent in the world. And this threatens, obviously, our society, our economy, and in particular, energy and food security, ecosystems, infrastructures, water resources, financial stability, human health, according to the European Environment Agency. And furthermore, more critical points are already reached in some of these risks. This implies that the European Union is playing its future on achieving clear progress to the green transition. And this makes essential analyze to assess the environmental effects behind this GBC restructuring and reshoring phenomena that can hinder or either support this fight against climate change. And the question is if greener and closer GBCs can provide synergies among these objectives, resilience, sustainability, climate goal. And one of our main conclusions is that moving production back or closer to the European Union while expanding circular economy practices could reduce emissions, enhance supply chain security, and stimulate green innovation. But the synergies are possible, but are not guaranteed. Why I said this? Because focusing on the European Union global value chains, our analysis of past GBC restructuring and focusing on geographical shifts between 1995 and 2018, this geographical shift, this change of the country of origin of supplies, contribute to the increase in the European Union carbon emissions footprint in the whole period. In the first period, before the financial crisis, the European Union carbon footprint was increasing by 15%, and the geographical shifts contribute to this growth by 23%. But also in the second period after the financial crisis, where the European Union carbon footprint was decreasing by 21%, the geographical shifts in international trade were contributing positively to the growth of carbon emissions by 6%, thus preventing a further fall in emissions in the European Union. In both periods, the main contributors were indirect emissions, so this highlights the need for policy measures that encourage carbonization to cover intermediates as well as final goods, and to include scope 3 to cover not only direct energy consumption, but all direct and indirect intermediates required by products. So in the past, the GBC reconfigurations contribute positively to the growth in emissions, but this has not to be the case, because our analysis of reshoring scenarios generate reduction in the European Union carbon footprint for these 5 strategical products according to the European Union policy: iron and steel, electric motors and batteries, chips and circuits, antibiotics and vaccines. The highest reductions are achieved in the iron and steel, with reductions of 13 megatons of CO2 of carbon dioxide emissions, and around 4 megatons in the case of electric motors and batteries and chips and circuits. Backshoring performs better in the case of iron and steel, and nearshoring in the case of electric motors and chips and circuits. So we identified synergies between the GVC resilience goal and the commitment to fight climate change, which is a good news. Besides, we found also minimal territorial emissions increases for the European Union and member states, though these increases were higher in the Eastern European Union countries, indicating that securing the uptake of low-carbon technology is vital to reducing emissions of European Union reshoring shifts. Also, as multinationals are very important in GVCs, we also study their role in the reshoring process. Moving back production of European multinationals producing abroad to the European Union in 3 strategic sectors such as computer, electronic and optical equipment, electrical equipment and basic metals generate minimal increase in domestic emissions and significant reductions in the carbon footprint, especially in the case of basic metals, which is an energy-intensive industry. Besides, they could provide an opportunity for European Union peripheral countries, since we found synergies between climate goals for these countries and convergence of these countries especially. Besides, we analyzed the possibility of combining reshoring with technology transfers between headquarters, multinationals, and subsidiaries. And we found that multinationals have a pool of best practices that can be benchmarked across the organizations, but subsidiaries are not forced to adopt these practices as long as they achieve the key performance indicators. Regarding location decisions, environmental factors are still secondary to the cost or market access. And our estimations of the reshoring from subsidiaries of European Union multinationals producing abroad to the European Union plus technology transfers improve emission reductions, obviously, but the impact is low within the same sectors, these technology transfers, but if combined with the decarbonizing electricity, the impact is high and could be around 12-13 of the European Union producer-based emissions. The previous results and analysis use as driver of the GVC reconfiguration the looking for resilience. But we can also analyze as driver of GVC reconfiguration the shift to low carbon suppliers. And this is what is called green sourcing or right sourcing. These strategies of green sourcing generate reductions in the European Carbon Union footprint about between 14 and 25% of emissions. And the higher reduction potential are found in manufacturing, computer, electronic and optical equipment, electrical equipment, transport, machinery, textiles, and food products. These results also will be encouraged by measures that are actually present in the European Union, such as CBAM, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The risk in this case is the resource shuffling that has the potential to undermine these positive effects at global level, not for the European Union, since if the adoption of cleaner providers by the European Union leads to other countries to use dirtier providers. And in this case, the global impact could be null or slightly increase the 0.5%. Regarding circular economy, the fundamental issue is the need to scale it up. The shift in global and regional production networks may provide new opportunities for circular business models and environmental upgrading. And to deploy this potential, achieving scale and volume is a major barrier for circular economy practices and take-back systems. Since circular economy practices will require new jobs, new occupations, novel production processes and logistical systems, it's necessary to invest in both skills and recycling, reconditioning technologies and capacities to scale up the circular models across industries. Also, circular intermediaries are required and can be vital to securing progress on core objectives such as rolling out training, managing reverse logistics, and creating the new networks required. Other measures that can help to scale up the circular economy is the development of extended producer responsibility schemes and harmonizing regulations and minimum standards, creating an European Union market for reconditioned products and also for waste. Support for R&D to bridge the remaining gaps in technological capacity and the promotion of collaboration across industries is also necessary, as well as public support to create more efficient cross-sectoral and cross-country solutions. These cross-country solutions requires the cooperation not only within the European Union, but also this should be expanded with neighboring countries and regions, particularly the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean area. Barriers to moving end-of-life products across borders in this region could be addressed by negotiating bilateral mutual recognition agreements. All this will help in secure new resources to circular economy, to ensure companies manage product end of life, would allow circular economy models to become financially viable, and to achieve scale and efficiency in circular economy models. Finally, the challenges and opportunities ahead, as a summary of our results, are align GBC restructuring with climate goals, internalizing carbon impacts is fundamental, prevent carbon leakage and resource shuffling in GBC shifts, monitor carbon content should be mandatory, enable low carbon reshoring in Eastern European Unions because they can become competitive low emission producers in this case, scale circular economy across borders, support intermediaries in this case also, implement common eco-design, EPR and European Union market effectively, and use the European Union trade to enforce sustainability and coordinate environmental, industrial, R&D and trade policies. And this is all for my side. We have also, as the previous presentation, our report and our policy brief in our page, web page. So I invite you to learn more about these environmental impacts in these two pieces. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for this kind summary of the huge work done on the environment. Now we move to the competitiveness issue with Torben Pedersen from Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. Please, Torben, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very delighted, of course, to be able to present our work here for you. And of course, I can also say that there's a lot of interesting papers that is behind this that you should read at the website, and of course our report and policy brief. So I can only give you a short flavor of what we have done here. So, of course, as we also actually heard with our keynote speaker earlier, so what is important is a little bit that you can say, when we started this project, the world looked a little bit different in the sense that you can say at that point in time, you can say we have this conception in the world that that we should exploit global division of labor. So a lot of the trade was based on this efficiency argument and things like that. We know a lot about what happened in that time. There's about functional specialization, increasing fragmentation of the global value chain, a lot of offshoring, outsourcing, and you name it. All that we have lots of data on, so to say. But then, of course, the world has changed here, and you can say now it's much more about geopolitical tension, on predictability, disruptions, and the logic is now much more about security and things like that. So it's a different world, and of course, our perception when we started was also that we will see a little bit, as like Cynthia's question there, we will see much more reshoring, much more nearshoring, we will see much more reaction from companies. And honestly, we haven't seen huge reactions there. Of course, we have seen, as we also have heard earlier, we have seen a little bit signs in the trade statistics that something is happening, but not big things is happening. And why not? Part of it is that what happened before, you can say, it was many decades where companies was outsourcing, offshoring, and adapting to customers or to suppliers and things like that in other parts of the world. So they have very close relationship, and you cannot just change them overnight. You cannot find a new supplier that offer exactly what you want on the shelf, so to say. So, and in a world like today, where we still have a lot of uncertainty, how should you change, so to say? So it's not so easy. So, and I will come a little bit back into that here. So, of course, the name of the game is much more about flexibility and resilience of the global value chains. It's much more about regional strategies and maybe regional value chains and things like that. And while we have lots of data on what happened before, you can say we have not a lot of data on what had happened here, also because all our secondary data, they are at least 1 or 2 years old or something like that. So what we have been able to do a little bit here to see the current developments is more to look at some primary data, surveys we have done ourselves. So we surveyed all larger manufacturing firms in Denmark to try to learn, is this something that really matters for companies? And you can see here is some of the responses. We asked them in the first column, you can see here, how likely is it that you will experience major disruptions in your global value chain in the next few years? And almost 95% say it's likely or very likely. So clearly it's something that matters for companies. It's not that they're ignoring this. It matters. And when we ask them about how significant are the following external factors for your companies, they also, we mentioned different disruptions here, potential disruptions, cyber attacks, regional conflicts, pressure for more sustainability and things like that. And they also, very high percentage here, that they say it's very significant, very likely that things like this will happen. So it's not that they ignore it, they're aware of it, but what are they doing? What are the risk mitigation strategies? So what we see is that there, of course, is different type of risk mitigation strategies. The first column, where we talk about no major global value chain restructuring. This is actually the most common thing. Because, as I said, we don't see a lot of global value chain restructuring. We see some, but not as much as we expected. But what we see is that they are really upgrading their risk management policies. They are doing much more scenario planning. They are doing much more early warning systems, much more trying to understand what is happening in all parts of the value chain, closer collaborations with their suppliers and things like that. What we call the scanning strategy here. So most companies are actually upgrading on that part. So they're able to react fast, to know what happens, and react fast and more agile. Other companies following, you can say, a buffer strategy where they build up muscles in terms of financial muscles, managerial muscles, and things like that. So they can, if something happens like a flood, some natural catastrophes, more temporary things, so they can actually absorb those kind of disruptions there. But then, of course, we also have other mitigation strategies that is about changing your global value chain. So, for example, you add more suppliers. So you go for single sourcing to multiple sourcing, or you build different redundancy, more capacity in your global value chain and things like that. But for sure, most companies are actually not making major changes in their global value chain so far. That's what we see. So, And another aspect we also looked at in this work package is actually what is the effects on different regions here. So here we should also be aware that regions are actually affected very differently when we see reshoring and nearshoring. In particular, you can say more advanced regions are actually benefiting significantly, while you can say less developed areas only see marginal improvement. So we should also be aware that even if we have reshoring and nearshoring, it also affects quite differently in the European region here. So finally, a little bit of our policy implications here. So one point we stress a little bit here is exactly this, that if there's any way we can, you can say, help companies to get more information about this, because what they really worry about is this uncertainty, and it's very difficult to react as long as you don't know where the world is going, so to say. So if we can help them getting better warning systems and things like that. And of course, then it's about strengthening local competences, so it's worthwhile coming back. So there's some industrial infrastructure when you come back, reshore, nearshore, and things like that. Be aware of how this is affecting regions, and also small and medium-sized versus multinational enterprises differently. And then, of course, finally, as we have heard a little bit about earlier, this about the intelligent trade and industrial policy. So I think with that, I will say thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Torben. So we now move to the scenario part. So as I told you at the beginning, we tried to, let's say, assume what would our world be if some conditions that were in the air at that time, and now sometimes are more than in the air, came to a reality. So we tried to assume what would have been the new trade policy scenarios for Europe when there is a tariff war in place. And this is something that Michael Landesman can present to you from the WIIW in Austria. Thank you very much, Michael. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, you listened to very condensed, rich presentations from my colleagues. I hoped I could offer you some lighter amusement, but my topic is not that amusing. Yeah. Well, I think in this analysis, probably Roberta was mentioning, it caught us by the end of our project that we have to take Trump seriously. And therefore, we try to do some quantitative work on that. We're not the only group who works on trade modeling, detailed trade modeling, and trying to analyze strategic trade policy, but this will be one of our contributions. So I mean, it's obvious that we're living in a world which is, in the short run at least, shaped by utterances by President Trump. And it does look as if there is a speeding up of a new global trade environment, a policy environment developing. But of course, behind that are much more longer-term trends, which I think are shaping the developments behind the scenes. Well, one obviously is that we are living through a world which is going to potentially accelerate, where the West is having a much less prominent role in international production, international trade, and probably many other things as well, obviously in demography and in technology, etc. Well, it was already mentioned that the rise of China was a very, very important phenomenon. It is the dominant power in manufacturing. And one might say that some reasons behind Trump's strategy is you can't have military strength without at least developing a very significant manufacturing sector to produce military equipment, basically. So it's not only the issue of trade imbalances here. And with China, we also see a fastly changing picture of technology competencies across the world. And apart from that, there is the issue of sustainability of imbalances in balance of payments in trade, and which behind that, of course, means we have to take seriously the relative relationship between savings investment rates in different parts of the globe, but also within the European Union, as we know from the euro crisis. So within this context of amazing dynamic, which we are as social analysts lucky to experience at the moment, we should see what research can do. And this contribution is basically trying to show that we try to set up a rather detailed trade policy framework and analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about that before in the next slide. Yeah, I think a number of groups, in fact, at least I know one group in Paris, one group in Kiel, which is also moving in this direction, looking at the amazingly developed statistical database we have now through global input-output structures, which allow us to look at supplies across country supplies of intermediates and investment goods and so on, and final goods, to look at input-output linkages across the world. We use a type of model which has obviously comparative advantage Ricardian features, but also takes geographic distances seriously. So it's a model which is very detailed, with 77 countries in the world accounting for the big bulk of global trade being covered, 45 industries, including service industries, and a detailed modeling of how trade responds to changes in prices, basically. And of course, tariffs affects price structures. But behind these elasticities lies different production possibilities in different countries, and of course, also employment structures. And the current research we are doing at the moment is also to introduce non-tariff measures through tariff equivalents. So we can also try to model how the use and the pressures, let's say, to change non-tariff measures might affect the global trading policy situation. And in sense, you can also say it's a way of introducing industrial policy measures like subsidies, which are also a way of analyzing the relative cost structures as they change. So I won't have much time to go over some of the exercises we do with it, but I will show two exercises. You will see, of course, tariffs, as you know from newspaper reading, affects inflation, in fact, prices. So the inflation effects from tariff setting, and therefore also on real incomes and on real wages. And of course, it changes the trade patterns because you have trade diversion effects from differential tariff developments. And on top of that, which of course Mr. Trump is very keen, given a very large budget deficits, and his ambitions in terms of fiscal policy, there is tariff income, which, as you would see in the simulations, is an important phenomenon also affecting different countries' positions. I will focus here now only on these three main global actors in this strategic tariff policy setting: the US, the EU, and China. So I'll report a little bit on two exercises. One is, in each of them, we start off with Liberation Day. We take that as the base. And then in the first exercise, we see how could the EU respond. Remember, this was done before the agreement, the more recent agreement was made between the US and the EU. At that point, the EU still thought we have the backbone to choose a more strategic tariff setting policy in response to the Trump setting. And we're using what we could call optimal tariff setting. And I think we exploit basically the disintegrated structure of the model to say which sectors should be more protected, less protected. And in fact, our, let's say, target function is it should minimize the welfare cost to oneself and maximize the cost to the other trading partner or any trading enemy, if you want. Yeah? So that's our welfare function or target function. And of course, if the EU does that, the US can respond in turn, yeah? And this can go over a number of stages, yeah? So this was probably what the EU in the DG Trade was facing as a potential option of a staggered tariff setting policy. And the other exercise was, well, I think what is going on between the US and the EU, but also the US and China, affects these trilateral relationships. So the second exercise was trying to see to which extent does more or less prohibitive protectionist structures between the US and China will affect EU's policy towards China, yeah? Because obviously we expect quite strong trade diversion effects from a blocking off of Chinese exports to the US and therefore to other markets. So let me come to a very, very quick summary. It's not that interesting. Probably in the aggregate terms, you can see at the bottom that the real wage effects are very substantial, basically, as one was predicting to the Trump administration. Tariffs increase prices in the domestic market. So you can see a very substantial initial. So the yellow bar is the first bar where you see the impact of Liberation Day tariffs, which are dramatic and therefore has a very strong impact on the real wage situation in the US. The next bars are basically these two other responses. The EU choosing an optimal tariff setting strategy across a structure of different industries. And the green bars are where the US retaliates in turn. So basically the biggest macro effects are the Liberation Day scenarios. The retaliatory tariffs will have structural impacts, but not such a strong macro effect. In fact, if you look at the top end, you will see something which you might find surprising. It's the overall welfare effect. The overall welfare effect is the effect on real incomes through price increases and, of course, wage adjustments as well, but also through tariff income. There you see in the first stage a monopolistic position, basically, of US in their own market without retaliation yet. Yeah? So the tariff income, as optimal tariff theory would also suggest, shows a rather positive welfare effect, yeah? Outweighing the real income effect. And in the model, this impact on tariff income is distributed to the households, to the US households. The second order effects are, in the macro terms, less interesting. But here you can see what our target function would produce in terms of, if you only look at goods, yeah? What sort of optimal tariff structures across different sectors would emerge from the EU's side. And as you can see, it's affecting both. We take into account, of course, the dependency of EU industries also on supply side, on supply chains, on GVCs. So you can see that both the comparative advantages matter, but also the dependency of intermediate inputs. But you can see the EU would impose quite strong tariffs on chemicals, on electronics and materials, transport equipment, etc. And this would be the retaliatory steps from the US side, who start with much higher base tariffs, which are already these Liberation Day tariffs. But you can see in this second round retaliatory effort, there are very substantial additional tariffs imposed on the US side, yeah, going over 100%. Now, the other interesting things, why should we only concentrate on goods? I mean, this was also a debate. So if you start to add services, and here two sectors are included, IT and finance, it changes the picture dramatically. I mean, the EU would focus almost entirely on IT and finance in terms of retaliatory tariffs, using the same target function, yeah? While from the US side in the retaliation, it's a much more dispersed picture. So the EU in this second stage would continue to put quite substantial additional tariffs on significant strategic industries on the EU side, but also on IT and finance. Okay, so if you look at these different stages, you can see that the baseline tariffs still on Liberation Day are still relatively low, actually, if you look at the combined effect. The effect of the baseline tariffs on trade. These are the effect on the trade flows, yeah? So it's minus 2 percentage points of EU trade flows to the US, yeah? And minus 7.3, but these retaliatory flows change quite dramatically the trade flows between these two economies, yeah? Moving to the US exporting minus 21% in the final stage, and the EU minus 25%. So these are the different stages how the trade flows are really dramatically affected. I will now move very quickly to the China example. So as you know, in the initial design of US-China relations, there were prohibitive tariffs imposed on China, 145%, and China and the US of 125%. But my main concern here is to just show the trade diversion effects, yeah? Here, again, you can see this initial proposal by the United States has very dramatic, again, real wage effects because of this imposition of tariffs on China, because they affect the US consumers, but also substantial tariff income effects, yeah? And obviously the US imports a lot and therefore earns a lot of money when it taxes those imports, yeah? So these are, you have, interestingly, of course, there would be trade diversion effects, positive trade diversion effects on Canada and Mexico, but because of the overall GDP and real income effects on the US, it can counter-effect it, and therefore they also suffer from further GDP decline. So here you can see the trade matrix, again, China's trade to the US as a result of these prohibitive tariffs would fall by about 70%. US exports to China, that's now only goods trade, by about 47%. The trade diversion effects, China to EU 27, is in the region of 2.2%. That's the aggregate, yeah, only goods trade. However, if you look at more detailed structural impacts, there are much stronger effects, yeah? So let me come to a final point, because I should finish. We have used this model in the project not only to analyze these trade policy conflicts, but for example, also to see to which extent the CBAM policy might be moderated, for example, in more concessions towards the EU South, yeah? Because that will be one of the important trade policy negotiations, so there's another paper on that. It seems to be, to us, very important to have an operational model of that type, which we can use in many ways to analyze the scenarios as they unfold. So it is an important model for potential to guide policymaking in trade negotiations. I think Roberta will talk also about some analysis of the trade policy environment on regions, and the Madrid group also worked on the impact on different regions from these various trade policy analyses. I think there was other important work in the project on non-tariff measures, how they affect location decisions by multinational corporations, which areas of multinational activities are particularly strongly affected. And as I mentioned earlier, we're introducing non-tariff measures and subsidies also into this trade modeling, because the policy conflicts across these big trading blocks is not only trade policy, investment policy, but also industrial policy and technology policy. So all these affect cost and comparative advantage structures of different economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for this presentation, which gives a flavor of the attempts that the Twin Seats did in order to take the future into account and what would have been. And as a last presentation, I will provide you with some results on can you see my slides? Yes. Yeah, great, good, thank you. So as Michael anticipated, we did also an effort to see not only the effects in terms of real wages and in any case in terms of efficiency of countries, but also on the income distribution, because tariff wars create problems also in terms of income distribution, and in particular, we were interested in regional inequalities. Why? Because we know that discontent and left behind places are, or in any case, in causes, they cause this kind of anti-European sentiment and anti-European sentiment. So the idea was to look at the official documents that were also mentioned by our keynote speakers, both the open strategic autonomy and the economic and technological security issues, and see what they had in, let's say, in mind, what they were expecting in terms of new trade policy. And as we know, and that's already been mentioned, the pillars on which the economic security is based are, from the one side, that the EU must seek independence from international partners, so we do not have to rely too much on specific and unique partners, because this creates vulnerability, and at the same time, it must assertively shape its trade relations. Putting all this together, and using a model, again, a quantitative model, macroeconometric regional growth model, as it is called, that we built 20 years ago, and we are now in the 5th edition of the model, we tried to simulate what would happen to regional inequalities, to regional growth, and therefore regional inequalities, when some assumptions are taken into consideration. So, as I said here, much less is said in this debate on the regional distributive effects of the new normal trade scenario. And this is what we, in Twin Seeds, we tried to do. What are the assumptions? Well, these are, okay, very clear, and they come from the documents and from what happened. These were made before the decisions in September. We assume that the coupling strategy from antagonistic countries, China and Russia, and we thought that the coupling strategy could be, the flows could, or the trade flows could be redistributed with other partners according to, proportionally to the capacity of trading with these partners by the EU, apart from the US, which is no longer interpreted as a friendly trade partner due to the Trump's tariffs that at that time, when we did the exercise, were only assumed, and now they became a reality. Then we assume a retaliation strategy by China and Russia vis-a-vis the US once we assumed that the coupling. A decrease in the overall EU international trade flows, coupled with the reinforcement of strategic core European industries, and this is something that is in the open strategic autonomy, so that's again something that is there. An enhancement of reindustrialization based on scale economies, pre-existing capacities of territories, so bringing back what we know and what we know how to do, and this is what also our keynote speaker reminded us, reinforcing industrial vocation in the different areas that suffered from offshoring strategies, because we we moved out the production. And then the strengthening of the single market and lowering administrative and organizational barriers among European member states. At the macroeconomic level, of course, we have increasing inflation, as Michael reminded us, loss of purchasing power, suboptimal resource allocation and decreased competition. So we have productivity losses and general stagnation of innovation adoption rates and location of production of renewables in rural areas. If this is the case, the map of Europe in terms of GDP growth, or let's say with respect to the present situation, is the one that you see here. It is not a matter of looking at the magnitude of the effect, but of the distributive effects, where the geographical distribution of the effects. And as you can see, it is a very striking effect, a very striking result comes to very clearly in place, which is that the effect is strongly heterogeneous among regions. We have the eastern regions and the southern regions that suffer the most, while in the center of Europe, especially in the southern Germany and northern Italy and this part of that area, is the effect is less pronounced. If we look more closely in which are the regions that display less pronounced decline due to tariff barriers, are urban areas with the exceptions of capital ones. So this is not the case for the capital cities. Western regions, more than regions located in the Central and Eastern European countries, and regions with high manufacturing employment rather than service employment. So these are those that lose the less. But what about inequalities in all these, regional inequalities? So regional inequalities would follow a binary trend. If we look at the between country disparities, these would increase. Why? Because Western countries have higher growth opportunities with respect to the Eastern ones. So we will again have a North and West Eastern dichotomy, which is going to be reinforced. What is happening is that within country disparities decrease. Why? Because manufacturing productive Eastern regions, second-tier city regions, are those that get higher growth opportunities, while, as we said, capital cities are penalized. And strong capital areas do not get higher benefits. So it means that we have a decrease in within country disparities that could tell us that this is a good point. But this is not, because what we get is that we become all poorer. So those that were richer become poorer. And this is why within country disparities decrease. And this is not something that we would like. So in terms of policies, what could we suggest? Trade policies and regional policies and regional inequalities are strongly interlinked. Trade decisions affect regions differently. And this is to avoid deepening disparities. Policies must reflect the diverse economic and trade profiles across the EU. So it means that they have to recognize regional heterogeneity in JVC structures and trade policies, avoid exacerbating inequalities through uniform trade policies, tailor trade strategies to regional strength and vulnerabilities, and balance decoupling, for example, from China and Russia with new partnerships. In terms of other aspects, we could suggest to support vulnerable regions. Some EU regions, in fact, are more exposed to the risks of reshoring than trade decoupling. Targeted policies can be thought and are needed to protect technological capabilities and support adaptation. Targeted support for regions at risk from JVC reshoring, monitor EU-US reshoring strategies to avoid technological decoupling, stimulate EU technological advancement and attract foreign investment from tech-leading countries, and promote place-based innovation, education, and capital accumulation. I think that I just gave a flavor of the complex relationships in all these. Again, as others have said before, a lot is in our publications and in our policy briefs that are available free on our website. Thank you very much. And now I think, here we are, okay. I leave the floor to Cinzia for moderating the debate. Thank you, Cinzia.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and thank you very much to all the speakers. We're now moving to the policy panel. So I would like to invite Michael to stay. And then to get on the floor, Josephine Norris, she's a member of the legal service, WTO law, international trade law at the European Commission, please. And Pierre Letruc is associate at the Institute for European Environmental Policy and coordinator of the Green Trade Network. And then Michael is sitting with us. So we thought that after having the presentation of the results from the project, so we heard quite a lot of content and ideas. It was good to have a bit of a discussion. And the idea was also to bring some external experts and some external views to reflect on some of the findings, but also to add some additional angles. So let me set briefly the scene for this session. So I think that one of the key messages that came out from all the presentations is that I mean, global value chains were somehow the key expression of globalization. No, it's really the fragmentation of production and the allocation of the different pieces of production really based on efficiency. And this is only possible basically in a world where you have certainty and reciprocity. And this is basically a rule-based system. Now, the question is that over the years, we have seen some threats, let's call it like this, or disruptions. We had COVID. This was an external shock. And because of this, the usual flows actually couldn't happen. We saw that companies actually managed to react in a quite quick way, showing quite a lot of resilience. Then we had the war, and also in this case, despite the uncertainty, the resilience of the system was quite strong. And now we have US tariffs. And here I think that the nature of the shock is actually quite different. Because this is not somehow an external shock. This is really man-made. Huh? So this is really, in fact, the United States, which were the founder of the rule-based system, are threatening it. So trying to dismantling it. And somehow I find this threat even more severe and serious than what we experienced over the last 5 years. Exactly because is driven by a will, while it comes as a decision. And this, I think, makes the uncertainty high because it's changing the rule of the game. And this is why I was saying I'm very surprised by the resilience of the system. And then actually there is a famous sentence by Rudi Dornbusch, some of you may know, it may not be an exact quote, but basically the point says being that in economics, things may take longer than you think to happen, but then they go much faster than you thought they would. So we may also be prepared for a situation where everything now is quite slow motion and no big change, but things could accelerate very fast. So in this sense, I think there is no time, no room for complacency, if both from the side of companies, but also from the side of policymakers. Now, with this reflections in mind, the panel, I think, has the idea to bring in 3 different angles. So the first one is the legal angle, which was not really covered in the project. And it's based on the idea that basically the legal framework and legal instruments actually can affect a lot the functioning of value chains. And basically this may be very different in a situation where you have the efficiency being the rule of the game, or in a situation where economic security or other concerns become a priority. And this is really the question that I would like to address to Josephine, and is this happening? Are we seeing a change in the use of legal instruments when it comes to global value chains? Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to join this very rich debate. I am here as the lawyer, and to quote the keynote speaker, one of the lawyers whose job it is to scream, I believe she said, about things like WTO compliance. So I wanted to just draw on really what you just said, to talk a little bit about the regulatory backdrop, because of course there is one. The EU is regulating in ways that impacts global value chains. And alongside the very rich trade toolkit with the FTAs, the partnerships, trade defense, we have a series of autonomous measures. And those autonomous instruments, or as I call them, GVC regulations, were adopted partly to reconcile the Green Deal objectives with this idea of open strategic autonomy. So you have the 2 policy streams that were really layered from the beginning. And of course, when I talk about these autonomous instruments, I'm thinking the deforestation regulation, CBAM, which has been mentioned already today, but there's a whole raft of other product measures, the batteries regulation, eco-design for sustainable products. The list is actually relatively long. And collectively, these instruments are designed to reinforce the European Union's non-economic values through the regulation of cross-border production. So the way that they operate in practice clearly is going to affect the global value chains connected to the internal market. They do so by design. These instruments are under growing pressure. I think that is one of the big trends we've seen. So what started towards the end of 2024 and continued in early 2025 as a simplification process that was focused really on attenuating burdens, particularly for SMEs, has, I would say, mushroomed somewhat now into the 6th, I think, omnibus package, really conducting a wholesale review of the way that these instruments are operating. And some of those proposals, if they're adopted, and I will come to that, if they're adopted in the form they were proposed, could really substantially change the regulatory frameworks that were adopted in some cases just 2 years ago. And perhaps the most obvious is around the corporate due diligence, the corporate reporting. There, the changes are really very substantial. But in the meantime, what we have with the stop the clock provisions, delayed implementation, and in some cases quite substantial changes on the table, is an ongoing institutional process which is creating quite a degree of regulatory uncertainty. And that in itself has an impact on global value chains. And frankly, it has an impact on businesses, including the ESG sector itself. So I now, maybe if I could go on and just make 3 brief reflections on a legal perspective on this shift. I think the first would be to come back to the dynamic nature of GVCs. And they are dynamic by definition. This is an economic construct which the EU tried to regulate legally, and whenever you try and legally regulate something that is inherently economic, it's going to get pretty complicated. So I think that this was anticipated at the design stage. In the way that many of these legal instruments were designed, there are mechanisms built in for adaptation. Where I come back to what you said in the opening, I think what perhaps wasn't anticipated was the rate and pace of change, or that would come from the tariff perspective. But there are mechanisms, and they haven't yet been fully tested. The second observation I would make is that a core objective of the EU's regulatory framework is about preventing fragmentation within the internal market. That was one of the main drivers for a lot of these regulations which affect global value chains. There was a lot of different regulation happening in the member states, and several of the speakers today have said that the obstacles can actually come from differences between member state frameworks. So now we have a competitiveness agenda. We've seen that the effects won't necessarily play out in the same way in all member states, but I would also point and just reflect that those regulatory divergences are also still there, and that is something which should be factored in as we revise the instruments themselves. And then the third reflection I would have is that we are in a time of evolving objectives. I think we've all seen that there was different generations, I would say, of ways that the European Union has sought to regulate global value chains, starting with the sustainable and the environmental and the social. And now we're moving more towards resilience. That is one of the big buzzwords of our time. I hear it a lot. And the question is, looking ahead, how can you use the same, or will they try and use the same regulatory approach? Because there are many instruments that are deployed, or many mechanisms within these instruments: traceability, reporting, due diligence, product passports. And the question is, will those tools all disappear as we shift towards resilience, or will we just sort of have a repurposing of the regulation? So I think that I come back actually to borrow a phrase that was used earlier, that it's really about looking for synergies, I would say, between decarbonization and resilience. So perhaps I have now exhausted my introductory speaking time, and lawyers can never stop when they're supposed to. So.
Thank you very much. This was really very clear and to the point. And I think it's also offers a nice transition to Pierre. So maybe a reaction to what Josephine said in terms of, well, we are somehow moving away from the times of the Green Deal and the clear green priorities for the EU. How do you see it? And if you have any reaction based on what it was said earlier, there were quite a few conclusions or recommendations in relation to the environmental aspects of GVC. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. But first of all, I really appreciate what you say about the uncertainty that it creates to engage in so many omnibuses, we can say, 6 of them, which is just an additional layer to the ongoing context of, I would say, yeah, global uncertainty. I'd like to start, if I may, with a depiction of that global context, because I think the most important thing is to agree on the diagnosis before, and I have 3 points. I'm also a lawyer, so I like to structure my my interventions. But first on the context. So I think I don't need to enter into too much detail on how the world is shifting to multipolarity through China, India becoming bigger and bigger, the BRICS and the multiplication also of agents on the global stage. That's something to take into account. Yeah, indigenous communities, different types of agents that we need to factor in this conversation. Uncertainty, global uncertainty, I think is a given. And I also like and appreciate the remarks of Michael, who said, if I may summarize it like this, it's the initial spark that actually lights the fire. Doesn't matter how many logs you put then in the fire. So we should be very attentive to these signs, to the weak signals. Maybe engage in more foresight, adapt our structures to make sure that we are prepared when the spark comes in. And I think what you presented on Liberation Day and the subsequent impacts of retaliatory tariffs, etc., says a lot about yes, this context of uncertainty and how much we need to factor that in. The other thing is that we moved, I think, for maybe a decade to multi-purpose trade policy. I think that's also a given. We try to achieve more and more through measures that are actually very much trade impacting. And so I'd like to take, of course, a sustainability angle, because what I like to do is research the trade and environment, in that case, nexus. And I do that through a network. Cynthia mentioned it, the Green Trade Network, which hosts over 50 researchers from different universities, think tanks, to discuss ongoing developments on how to reconciliate trade policies and the fight for environmental protection and the fight against climate change. So I've identified 3 main areas through which we can deal with this new geopolitical context and through which the EU can weigh in, I would say, a bit more, because it's a bit too shy, as we've seen with the EU-US statement. Maybe we can come back to this later, but first of all, of course, concluding new types of partnerships to deal with the weaponization of certain commodities and of certain products, as we've seen with CRM, and also the high volatility in the goods that drive the transition. We see that in cobalt, for instance, there's been a drop of 30% in cobalt prices in 2024, and then a surge of over 60% in 2024, and a surge of 60% in 2025 due to export restrictions from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we need to address that by diversifying. I think that's obvious, and I think that's also the reason why the European Commission is going to conclude tomorrow this deal with, finger crossed, with Indonesia, while we are accelerating this agenda of FTA conclusions. There's also Malaysia. We are also reviving the CPTPP discussions. So this is to address, I would say, yes, this new context. We also have a diversification of trade partnerships. The clean trade and investment partnerships were mentioned. So I think we need to address this from a cooperative angle, because since the start of the Green Deal, I think we've mainly focused on reducing the impact of EU domestic consumption through trade measures. But I think we also need to acknowledge that these are global challenges and that we also need to use trade partnerships to create cooperative spaces. And FTAs have been very efficient in provoking regulatory cooperation between partners, etc. So we need to learn from that and maybe go a bit further in the number of commitments that we get from our trading partners, while maybe committing to tech transfers, international climate finance. That's, I think, the purpose of the CTIPs. It's a bit to merge the JETP's approach with the FTA's approach. Second point, which is to me very important, it's ensuring consistency in the way we design policies, public policies. We've seen that very recently with the way the EUDR was designed without prior trade impact assessment. And I think that's the core reason why it triggered so much tension on the international stage. Now I know that the Commission has set itself the commitment to conduct a trade impact assessment every time it designs an environmental measures with extraterritorial reach. So that's a good point. But with the EUDR and the way it was designed, we are now discovering that, of course, if traders start behaving differently in different commodities, it will just land in trade diversification, trade diversions, and a status quo in terms of global deforestation. So we need to work on the consistency between the way we design measures and the real global objectives that we are trying to fulfill. For CBAM, it's also still unclear whether and how the EU will apply default values depending on certain origins. So I think it's also something that comes back, because I'm just back from Geneva, from the WTO Public Forum, and I know that a lot of the tensions that it triggered was stemming from the fact we didn't have a clear blueprint of what CBAM would be until very recently. And even now, I would say a lot of businesses are still very unclear on how much it will impact their processes. So, and if I can add to that a word on circularity, because we tend to oftentimes focus a lot on climate, but circularity, resource management is very important as well. I think we need a single market for secondary products, and as soon as possible. The Circular Economy Act is due for the end of 2026, but I think we need to urgently work on the harmonization of what we call waste, etc., across the member states, because it's still not the case, and we are facing currently a big case of leakage of certain scraps. That's mostly the case for steel. More than 25% of the steel scrap that we produce in the EU is exported to jurisdictions with lower standards. And if we really want to foster the emergence of a secondary market in these high-emitting sectors, I think the Circular Economy Act will be a cornerstone for this. Third point, and I will stop there afterwards, promoting multilateral avenues. Obviously, the EU has been always a great proponent of the WTO global trading regime based on rules, and I think that's something that should be really a red line for every conversation. And I was really surprised that we didn't manage to at least agree with Canada, with Japan, with Korea, etc., with like-minded partners to go engage in the negotiations with the US with that kind of like initial principle that any type of trade negotiation had to be somehow respectful of the global trading system and the need to respect international legality. Because I think if there is one thing that Trump has damaged since he has taken office, it's really the respect for international conventions and international law. So there are promising steps forward that are currently taken. The one that I wanted to mention is the proposal made by the Brazilian presidency of the COP to create a forum on trade and climate. I think that could be a nice space if countries manage to agree on that. It's under the action agenda of the COP30. But it's nice to see trade and climate being addressed in different forums, not only at the WTO. It's been a bit difficult to talk about climate at the WTO, but now even more in a COP context. So this idea to maybe deconflictualize the discussion on trade and sustainability, and especially on trade and decarbonization efforts, I think is very welcome. We are not discussing global carbon pricing, etc., but at least having a space to anticipate the trade tensions that measures like CBAM or like the UDR will inevitably trigger, I think is very good. But that is provided that this space will not be about CBAM bashing all the time. So we need to see still what kind of lines and narrative will be used for that. So I think we need to have this policy mix approach that measures to address the impact of our consumptions are never enough, that we need also to liberalize low carbon technologies, to recognize different schemes and different policies. That's a work that is currently being also done at the OECD through the International Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, making progress on MRV systems recognition, etc. So I think this chapter, which I call chapter 3 of the Green Deal on addressing the extraterritorial impact, is only starting to take shape. It's a very exciting phase, and at the same time it's very difficult. But very happy to come back on all this after. Thanks. I've been too long.
Thanks, Pierre, for this really rich overview of the many initiatives. Before I move to Michael, I would like to ask you something. I mean, one of the main findings of the project that was presented is that basically shorter and closer global value chains could produce good synergies to achieve climate objectives. At least this is my understanding. Any thoughts on this? How these synergies could happen, and maybe what policy can do to stimulate synergies?
If you look at CBAM, for instance, we see that the biggest shocks, economic shocks and economic spillovers of CBAM are located in the neighboring regions. Egypt is hit hard through fertilizers. You have Ukraine, but Ukraine is not. It's not the same case anymore. UK was also one of the biggest hit countries. Now that there's the ETS leakage, it's a bit different. But of course, I think it was presented as well that a lot of the neighboring regions' sustainability challenges is about the electricity grid and building electricity and getting access to sustainable and affordable electricity. So I think that the biggest challenge for our relationship with the closest country is investing in infrastructures, helping them in that way. The JETPs were very promising in that way as well. Maybe some form of, and the neighboring policy for sure can also help in this direction. So yeah, there's of course a big intersection between relocation to neighboring countries and ensuring decarbonization of our supply chains.
Okay, so we need to leverage on this forced readjustment to actually get the best out of it. I think this is really crucial. Let's come to Michael. So in the last couple of months, I wrote 2 short pieces. One basically arguing that the Commission did well in not reacting with countervailing tariffs. And the second one, quite recently, is that actually it seems that the US economy is doing quite well, but actually it's not the case. And I got a lot of reactions, and many people have told me, no, you are completely wrong, both on the tariff side, because even in this house we had a lot of discussions about whether the EU should have reacted or not. So views are quite different, even among economists. And then on the US one, basically my point is that, well, as your model predicts, is actually that tariff have negative effect for the economy which imposes the tariff, which is the United States. And one of the main transmission mechanisms is prices, that we should see inflation. Now, if I've been monitoring US inflation in the last month, and basically we had 2.7 in July, 2.9 in August, but basically we are not seeing a big impact on inflation. I mean, certainly much lower than one would have expected, given that basically the across the board tariffs, and in some cases the rate is even Switzerland has now 39%. So. And so I get many people telling me, look, I mean, economics doesn't work anymore. The United States is doing well. Inflation is not there because probably companies are absorbing completely, the exporters are absorbing the price change. And there are fiscal revenues. So I sense that some people are trying to sell the narrative that actually tariffs are not so bad. So, Michael, what is your view? I mean, I do not believe this narrative. As I said, my point is that it will just take some time to show. But I mean, you have a lot of insights from the model and also quite a lot of experience. So, what is your take on this?
Thank you very much. Yes, probably to your question, I think this is still on the table rather than properly implemented, yeah? Quite a lot of them, yeah? But I think overall there are a lot of things happening at the same time, no? I mean, we can see in the employment figures that the economy has slowed down, so there's also something to follow up in terms of wage growth and costs. And America is, of course, a big economy. Imports are probably 12–13% of GDP here. It's goods. So yeah, I think it could very well be that this tariff impact won't have this huge inflation jump. Yeah, I think there will be probably interesting distributional issues because as we see in many other countries, price spikes are affecting different households differently. At least we hope that it will have some political repercussions in the midterm elections from the constituency of the current administration. But I think, and as you said, there are potential giveaways. Yeah, we don't know yet exactly how this. I mean, there was the beautiful bill which is supposed to affect tax structures. How it affects directly which sections of the household sector is another thing, but there is some compensating mechanism here. I think it's, yeah, I must say I'm still quite unsure myself whether we have fully modeled that. Yeah. Let me come to a few other points, if you if I may. Well, I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect a little bit what we did as a project for a policy panel. Yeah? What did we really contribute and what didn't we? I think a lot of my colleagues have pointed out that we made quite substantial contributions in a number of policy areas. Yeah? And in some areas we didn't, but it's quite clear that on climate policy and environmental policy, there were quite significant quantitative contributions. There was something on regional policy. There was something on employment effects and employment and skill policy. And broadly on industrial technology policy. Yeah? The area we didn't cover is very much capital markets. It wasn't our brief. We are real economy people, but obviously capital markets are very part of the discussion on the issue of the Draghi report, etc. And we didn't cover the most recent important area of policymaking, which is defense and security policy, yeah? Which again spills over into the other areas. Yeah? But I think that probably one point I wanted to make is what we learned from this project and from the policy analysis. A research community has to take much more seriously policy trade-offs. Yeah? And I think there are many policy trade-offs which we, I think, have to make much more explicit. Yeah? I think it's already in the public debate that industrial policy might have an impact on competition policy. Yeah? That there are important trade-offs. Yeah? How you organize the internal market and how you organize your presence on the international market in terms of competitiveness. We know that there are problems of industrial technology policy and regional policy. There are strong agglomeration effects, yeah, which might be very conducive for competitiveness, but might lead to regional inequality. We might have a strong impetus, which was pointed out, on innovation, but the structural skill demands might be such that you might have strong effects on wage structures, yeah, which might be against the idea of social cohesion. Yeah? So I'm just making a few of these points, but I think probably it reflects also the structure of policymaking. Yeah? We have many DGs, we have many ministries in countries who have their area of policymaking, but the interesting and important points are to analyze what sort of connections there are and what sort of trade policy trade-offs there are. Yeah? And these have to be made explicit by the research community, and it might bring some more fact-based analysis of where policymakers locate themselves in these trade-offs. Yeah? I think policymakers probably have the tendency of harmonize, to look at the picture in a much more harmonic way then it actually is. The same thing is true on the analysis of climate change and so on. The further point I wanted to make on that is the time dimension. Different policies work with different speeds, yeah? And when we think about the whole evolution of globalization, it took quite long until we looked at the employment distributional implications, yeah? The first analysis was all in the direction of how wonderful it is for company strategies, yeah, and for international trade flows. And I think the impacts on and the visible thresholds were reached at which society was perceiving the employment and distributional impacts came rather late. So I think, again, as researchers, we have to learn to take time dimensions of the impacts rather seriously. And the last point I want to make is the EU is particularly a complex organism to deal with these issues. Because if we move to a world in which strategic policymaking starts to take much more place compared to normative, cooperative policymaking, we are faced by other actors where strategic policymaking is much more immediate and in a decision-making structure much more centralized. Yeah? So when you started off with a Dornbusch statement, sometimes things evolve slowly, but sometimes they speed up. We see that in the policy domain now. Yeah? I mean, the underlying structural forces which led to multipolarity and the rise of other new competitors and so on were there for a long time to monitor and analyze. But the policy changes which are going on are dramatic. Yeah? And in this game of dramatic speeding up of policy reactions, the EU has a structure which makes it a very reflective, consensus-making organism, but not quick to be able to play its game, to play as an equal player in this game of strategic policymaking.
Thanks, Michael, for these reflections on the trade-offs, and I can't agree more on your last point, which I think raises a very fundamental challenge to the EU, because it's a multi-level institution and a multi-level decision-making, which of course makes it slow and based on consensus, which therefore takes time. But also, I think it's a threat for democracy, because in a democratic setting, taking decisions takes time. So in a sense, that the EU appears as somehow in a weak position compared to autocracy. And this is, I think it's completely misleading, because it may lead us actually to say, we don't need any more democracy, or we should overcome democracy because we need to take strategic decisions fast. And this, I think, it's extremely risky and could bring really major damage. So I can't agree. I do not have a solution, basically, on how to take faster decisions, but respect certain principles and democratic principles. But I see this as a major challenge and a threat for the EU. I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any, please raise your hand. That's the time. Maybe also reflections on the findings that were presented in the previous panel. Yes. No, don't worry. It's Xavier is helping me. Thanks, Xavier.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations and panel. My name is Peter Wojcik. I'm with the European chemical industry, CEFIC, here in Brussels. And the chemical industry is also experiencing dramatic changes in trade patterns, in production. We talk about closures of big plants right now. What I miss a little bit between these panels and the keynote speech is looking at the dynamics of what is happening with trade flows, with sectors, with their competitiveness, and then looking at the latest developments of Trump. That is only, I think, a minor trend in comparison to the global developments that we see an increase of imports, decrease of exports, decrease of production inside Europe. And I don't see that trade policy in terms of raising tariffs on our own is the answer. And CBAM is one example where we create another cost for Europeans with good intentions to give carbon a cost, but I see this is a risk of making everything even more expensive than it already is. And all this good resourcing that was mentioned in one of the presentations, making things closer to Europe because it is better for the climate, this is also not the answer to competitiveness. So I miss a little bit a hint to where could we go next? What is the move? And it's certainly not the move to make Europe even more powerful, more central, more concentrated. I think we need a new debate, maybe more democracy rather than less. Thank you.
Any other question? Yeah, Jose.
Thank you very much. José González Mínguez from Banco de España and the House of the Euro. Now, I have two questions. One, so the reconfiguration of the global value chain seems to have, as we saw in the initial presentations, seems to have likely large effects on the carbon footprints of different areas in the world, no? Different regions in the world. So my question is whether you have any idea whether the lower degree of microdata that we are going to have as a result of the revision of the CSRD and CS-DDD, whether this lower availability of data at the micro level will not come precisely at a time in which we would need to have more information about those changes in the carbon footprint. So maybe we are going to be left there with lower information at a time at which probably we need more information. The other point is related to something which was said in the presentation by Laura. No? So it was explained how one of the main results of that part of the work was that the reorganization of global value chains can have an impact in terms of job polarization. And then one of the results there was that this job polarization is lower wherever employment protection legislation is higher. However, I guess that there are here important considerations depending on the time horizon that we are considering. Higher employment protection legislation can avoid higher job polarization in the short run, but it may have important efficiency costs in the medium and long run, since it will make more difficult the necessary restructuring in the economy. And then maybe one can also take into consideration other types of labor market policies, more active labor market policies which allow reskilling and requalification of the workers. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was another question there.
Good afternoon. I'm Marie Cormand from the Financité Association. Trade is paid for with American dollars. Is this likely to change? And will the euro be used more, the digital euro, or will cryptocurrencies be used, the stable coins? So that's my question.
I think that there is a fourth question, and then we come back to the panel. The lady there.
Thank you so much. My name is Laura Rozzo with Fleishman Hillard. My question is more on the rules-based system and in terms of what the EU can do to revive the rules-based system, to defend. What are the concrete elements there? Because I've followed very closely the public forum in Geneva of the WTO last week. I followed this closely. We hosted WTO people in our offices to talk to businesses, and businesses do see the value of the rules-based system, but at the same time, they asked to move fast to the EU, which is comparing apples and pears, because the EU is not a country, first of all, and then democracy, as the point that was really raised now. So just concretely, what can we do to revive that? Sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Okay, I think there are quite a few questions. Anyone who would like to start? Josephine.
I will start because I'm not going to answer all of them. I'll stick to my areas of expertise. Actually, my first remark would be that the intervention from first question and your intervention showed precisely some of the tensions that there are when it comes to regulatory design, because any form of regulation has a cost. So actually the carbon border adjustment mechanism was designed to prevent carbon leakage, and it's a price that's actually payable by importers. And yet, indeed, many EU businesses complain that it also impacts their cost base. So that is the cost of having a high level of regulatory ambition. It's also felt domestically. And then the second question is what happens when you water down all of the regulatory ambition that was enacted very, very recently and start saying, let's have less data. And I think from a purely legal perspective, one would say that removing reporting obligations does deprive the regulator of the information that they were looking for in order to tailor their regulatory regime. So just from a legal perspective, it would be great to keep the data and not water down all of the ambition. But you're talking about the two perspectives, one from the one who bears the costs of providing the data and the other from the person who wants it, really. And then just to come to the rules-based system, which is perhaps unsurprisingly a topic closer to home for me, I think that the European Union, it's really worth bearing in mind, is actually institutionally committed to multilateralism. It's in the treaties, Article 21, it's one of the foreign policy objectives. So it's not really open to the EU in legal terms to simply chuck it out and say we're going wholly rogue here. And I think that the European Union is still committed to multilateralism, or at least all of the LTT, lines to take that I've seen, reiterate how attached we are and the engagement in the WTO is going on. But there is a practical issue, and that is indeed, I would say, the need for speed, which we're feeling on all sides. We're pushing through a very ambitious regulatory agenda. They thought the Green Deal went fast. You should look at the new industrial policy. It is very fast, and at the same time, that does create these tensions with impact assessments, with stakeholder consultation. When is that supposed to happen? And really to bounce off what you said, we are a sui generis, very unique institutional structure. So the US can issue an executive order overnight, and if we follow all of our procedures in the treaty, there are many, many stages. And I think we've all heard the comments of the Parliament recently on how we're responding. So I think that the will is there. The practical question of the how do you go fast is a difficult one, but there is a lot of outreach still between the like-minded. I think it's a mistake to say that we're not talking to like-minded countries. The conversations are happening. The FTA negotiations have been accelerated massively. We've been talking to Indonesia for a long time, and now hopefully that will lead somewhere. But, and this is really my final comment, when you have an FTA, you talked about the level of ambition. Let's have more sustainability ambition. A free trade agreement is only ever going to be as ambitious as the lowest common denominator you can secure with the partner on the other side of the table. And that too comes back to the need for speed. The faster you go, something has to give to get the agreement over the finish line. So I now pass to whoever else wants to.
Pierre, maybe? No, that's why I'm jumping on your comment before responding to a few questions. But that's why I found the statement with the US a bit worrying. It's because usually in a trade conversation, in a trade negotiation, you have non-regression clauses. And here we're starting with something that is basically the opposite. Having a party observing that the other has a problem with its unilateral measures. So this could set a precedent that goes in the opposite direction of the revision of the Trade and Sustainable Development strategy that the Commission has adopted in 2022. So yeah, obviously you can't do everything with FTAs, but the problem is also that bilateral relations that we have do not necessarily penetrate the multilateral scope and level, and all the efforts that we are putting in training people on carbon accounting, doing cooperation with administrations on everything related to climate measurement and everything, does not have an impact on our capacity to deliver on the climate diplomatic stage. And I think that's one of the lessons we need to take. On the first question, I would say that if there is one thing that is inevitable and predictable, it's climate change, and it's the necessity to decarbonize. And I think the ETS has been created in 2008 exactly for that purpose, with a stated aim of decreasing the number of available allowances over time. CBAM is just like the logical consequence of the phase out of free allowances, and it's something that could have been anticipated much way before it got in. So I was surprised also by the level of unanticipation that we discovered. I'm sure you're all aware of the systems of windfall profits of reselling free allowances that were put in place by certain big companies, mostly large companies that are still making billions of euros of annual profits, especially in the cement industry. So that's not to say that there is no problem behind that, but we should not assign too many policy objectives behind climate policies, and CBAM for me is really meant to be clean at home and make sure that this is not hard to diminish as much as possible the repercussions. On macro data, I mean, this is a trend, this is a global trend. Trump has been already announcing that the US will withdraw some of the legal obligations for businesses to report climate and carbon emissions data. They will even maybe not comply with the IMO's carbon tax. I mean, this is a global trend as well, and I'm sure that the EU could benefit if we provide this market to operators that have sustainable and data that they can provide. There's for sure a market that is going to be growing in the future. I mean, if we are hopeful and if we think that the future is a future that is decarbonized, this is a data that will be valuable in the future. So changing trajectory and revising the CSDDD is also, I think, not the best option, even economically, because businesses say they already have invested massively in reporting processes and everything. So staying the course, I think, on this is absolutely key. And on the WTO, yeah, we had a session on the WTO without the US. I was surprised that it was on the official agenda and that for once they were all acknowledging that we had to do something to revive this system. As I said, Canada, Korea, Japan, there are so many countries with which we can at least commit to work together on the multilateral front. But I'll leave the floor to Michael. I don't know.
Well, I also wondered whether Maria wants to speak about potential conflict between CBAM and the interests of particular industries. But, well, there were a number of, yes, on the multilateralism, I think I probably agree with you that the current discussion amongst economies is whether one can rescue partial developments of multilateralism in the global economy. Yeah? It's of course problematic if some of the big actors like the US and partly also China are not part of that or have very different agendas in this respect. So it's almost like a belief of European colonial heritage being able to recover a subgroup of the global economy in that. But anyway, I think it should be a target of Europe too, because its own economy is highly developed, highly dependent on some survival of a rules-based system. On the other hand, you were saying that it is part of the constitution of the European to be multilateral, but it's already in a response to, for example, a Trump action. It's violating MFN agreements, for example. Yeah, you might have a different view of that, but it's very difficult to develop strategic trade policy positions. Yeah, when important trading partners are not adhering to those rules. Yeah, it might still survive with other partners, but okay. Well, I think I was struck a bit by the director of DG GROW, Ms. Lottboom, when she spoke about one interesting comparative advantage of the EU because of the slow speed of adjustment, which is regulatory stability. Yeah, okay. So this might indeed be a competitive strength of Europe. Yeah, a reliability of structures not changing, policy frameworks not changing very much, and you can rely on that. On the other hand, I'm a bit skeptical about this continuous iteration. We are a market of 450 million people, etc. Here, it's true, but it's shrinking. And if you look at demographic projections of a single country like Nigeria, it's going to be of the same size of the whole of the European population in about 30 years' time, more or less. Yeah, it's moving in the direction of. So I think this reliance on the strength of the internal market as the big pull factor here on dominating trade relationships might become increasingly problematic. I think the topic you talked about, labor market implications, these are amongst labor economies very much researched and disputed areas. Yeah, how labor market regulation, how protection legislation here affects labor markets. Yeah, it might very well lead to, again, to more polarization, yeah? In a sense that obviously these are minimal rules, yeah, which one applies, and safety guards, which might actually improve the overall standards, but protects more the higher skilled and better placed people in the labor force. But on the other hand, there are also other research results which mention that one can pull up minimum standards without negative effects on the lower tail end of the employment distribution. I think it's a complex area to really analyze these issues. There was a question on the role of the euro and the dollar in the long run. I think the position of the most experts who study that at the moment is that there's still quite a long way to go before the dominance of the dollar can be threatened, yeah? And especially given the weaknesses which the euro system has shown actually since the financial crisis, the euro crisis, the probably pretty laggard movement towards the capital markets union here, and building up assets which are in some way competitors to the US bond market. Yeah, I think we're still remaining a really slightly significant but still marginal figure, not with respect to the neighborhood and the main trading relations we have with neighboring countries, yeah, but at the global scale, I think it's unlikely. Nonetheless, I think with any reforms of capital markets union and development of debt instruments and so on, that might improve, yeah. On the other hand, I think the fragmentation of the global economy might very well lead to other capital markets developing in Asia, which might be competitive, a serious additional competitor. I think that's, yeah, probably. I mean, there is this issue about CBAM, and I think it's, from my perspective, I think there will be continuous negotiations, yeah, with the Southern. I think it was initially conceptualized very much from the interests of European industry here, but not really in an iterative perspective of negotiating with the other partners in the global system. And I think we are in a probationary phase at the moment. So I think a lot will happen over the next year in terms of adjusting, and some bilateral or multi-regional agreements which might be modifying the CBAM structure.
Maybe just my 2 cents on some of the issues that were discussed, and then we close. It happened to me to be in the community of global investors. And one of the questions I asked was, is one of the competitive advantage of Europe actually to be a region of stability? And the answer was, yes, but we need more policy certainty. And what is going on about reporting and the uncertainty doesn't help, because there is still seen the region where actually climate objectives are clearly still there, despite all the discussion, but the policy uncertainty is actually an element which is going to block investors. So there it's really important to bring some clarity. And then maybe on the international role of the euro. Well, the dollar dominance somehow is under threat, no, because of the US policies. But the reality is that there is a lot of inertia in these processes, and there is not a single alternative. That's really the problem. So basically, I would expect to have an increase in the role of all the currencies, maybe the euro, the yuan, the Chinese yuan for Asia. China has already increased a lot the currency denomination of Chinese exports, so where it imposes basically the yuan, and we will see a lot more of stable coins. So it will be a much more varied system. And on this, I would like to close. Many thanks for bearing with us. We are 10 minutes late. I think it was very rich and quite a lot of food for thoughts. Many thanks to the speakers for sharing their thoughts, and to those online.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.